Hello team at Pragmatic Works, this is Dustin, and if you don't know me, my name's Dustin Ryan, and I'm one of the senior consultants here at Pragmatic Works. And in this short, very educational and highly informative video, we're going to be talking about implementing security with analysis services. Okay. So in this short video, we're just going to talk about setting up security and analysis services, and basically it's just a way for us to configure user access to the cube and control who sees what in our analysis services database and in our cubes. So we're going to talk about defining dimension security. We're going to talk about configuring cell level security, and then we're going to finish up with implementing dynamic security. So when you're setting up your analysis services security, this is a process that's going to take place during development of the cube. So if you're not the cube developer or you are the cube developer, this is something that the developer of the cube will do. So this is going to this could require changes to the database to allow the dynamic security model that we're going to talk about, or this could be it's just a strictly a development process that will take place at the design time of the cube. And this, when we talk about implementing dynamic security, this is also going to require us to use a little bit of MDX, but we're going to walk through setting up these three different types of security: the dimension security, the cell level security, and the dynamic security. Basically, when we're setting up security to our cube, we can control access to the data source, which in the case of the cube is not something that we'll normally do, but if we were doing something with data mining, we might want to give our users read permission to the underlying data source. We're not really going to talk about that because we're not talking about data mining in this example. We can also control a user's access to the dimensions. So we might want to give users read access to the dimension data, and we can do that at a couple different levels. So we could give them read access to a dimension at the database level. So if just to kind of clear things up, if you're new to analysis services, you can create an analysis services database that contains multiple cubes. So we can control access to a dimension at the database level, which a dimension at the database level could be shared across multiple cubes. So we might want to control access to the dimension at the database level, or we might only want to control access to a dimension at a certain cube level. I hope that made sense. And then we can also control access to dimension data. In the final example, when we talk about setting up dynamic security, we can basically just grant or deny permissions to certain dimension members. One time I worked on a project where we created an HR cube for one of our bigger clients, and they had one of the dimensions that they wanted to set up security based on was the organization dimension. And so they were going to have HR managers that were going to be logging in to look at some of the data in the cube, and so they didn't want these HR managers to be able to see their employee count numbers and different other statistics for organizations that were not their own. And so we set up a security model where they could only see their organization, and we're going to talk about how to do that too. And that's the part that's going to require us to use MDX. Okay. All right. So cubes, we're going to also walk through how to grant permission to access the cube data, how to allow them to be able to drill through. That part is pretty straightforward. So I already talked about dimension access permissions. We're going to talk about granting or denying permission to view the cell level data. And when I say cell level data, I'm talking about the measures in the cube. So when I'm talking about dimension, I'm talking about the different ways we could slice the cube. It's by like product categories or organizations or anything like that. When I'm talking about cell data, I'm talking about measures. So I'm talking about sales numbers, order numbers, different things like that. Okay, and then when we talk about defining dimension security, we're going to look at how we can set up allowing a read our read and write access. We can also create allowed sets, which are basically defining which sets in the cube the role is allowed to see. And we're going to show how to set up denied sets. And a denied set are sets in the cube that the role is not allowed to see. Then we'll take a look at also how to set up a default member. So if a person is a part of a certain role, we may want to configure a default member for that role, so that way the very first time they look at the cube, they see a certain slice of the cube. And then we'll talk about visual totals. I won't really try to describe that. It's just usually easier to show than explain. And then when we talk about configuring cell level security, we basically are setting up read permissions to allow users to view certain measure data. We'll talk about setting up the read contingent permissions, which is basically saying that users are only allowed to see calculated measures if they have permission to see the base measure. So if you have a calculation that takes two measures and adds them together, if they don't have permission to see both of those base measures, then they won't be allowed to see the calculated measure that uses both of those base measures. And we'll look at read and write permissions for that as well. All right, then we'll come back to this piece in a second, but let's go ahead and jump right into the demo. I've got Visual Studios open here, and I've got this small cube here. This is actually the example cube that I use when I teach the Introduction to MDX class. So if you want more examples of this cube and working with this cube and using the security model that we're going to look at here, you can download the class videos, which are on the FTP site, which if you're an employee of Pragmatic Works, you should have access to. Let me just give you a short tour of this cube before we start digging into security, so that way you can just see what we're working with. This is a very simple cube. I'm looking at the DSV here. We've got a fact table here. This is our reseller sales measure group. Then we've got our reseller dimension here, geography, we've got date, got a sales quota, looks like a little sales quota table here, product subcategory, and product category. So pretty simple dimension here, or pretty simple design here. You can see over here that we've created 4 dimensions. We've got geography, we have date, we have product, and we have reseller. And I think that's pretty much it. So when we start when we start to implement our security here, Analysis Services uses role-based security. So we're going to implement our security through roles. So to create a new role, I'm going to right-click on the roles folder here, and I'm going to click New Role. And you can see probably the first thing you notice is that it's called Role, the name of the role, and that's not very helpful. So we'll probably name this something more meaningful. If I want to name this something different besides role, I just need to right-click on the role over here in the Solution Explorer and select Rename. So we'll call this dimension role, since it's going to be our example that demonstrates how to set up a role that has access to only certain dimensions. And when you get this message here that says, would you like to change the object name as well, make sure you click yes. You always want to click yes for that. Okay, so we're going to take a look at each of these tabs here in the role designer. So here on the general tab of the role designer, you'll see that we can set the database permissions for this role. So basically, full control means that this role will have full control over this database. Process database, if I check this, that means that the users in this role can process this database. And then if I check the box next to read definition, this means that users in this role will have access to the metadata associated with the database. So that's pretty straightforward. On the membership tab, this is where we'll configure which users or groups could be a member of this role. So usually when I'm working on a project for a client, they'll tell you the client will tell you which groups or users should be part of which roles. And so if we were creating a role for all of the HR managers, they might have a group set up for their HR managers, or other types of managers or something like that, and they'll tell you that, and so then you can just add that group here. But I'm just going to leave this blank for now since we're just doing an example. And then here on the Data Sources tab, this is where we can configure whether the users in this role will have access to the underlying data source. On the Cubes tab, this is where we can set up should the user have access to the cube itself. So I'm not sure, unless we have some data mining going on, some data mining structures going on in here. Not really sure why we would say they do not have access to the cube, but we'll leave that read for this example. The local cube drill through access, we could say, do they have access to drill through, or drill through and the local cube. We'll just leave this as is. And we're going to skip the cell data tab. We'll come back to that in a minute. And we're going to stop at the dimensions tab. So one thing I want to point out here on the dimensions tab is I had mentioned before, we could set up security at the database level for a dimension, or at the cube level. So you can see I want the first item here in the drop down list next to select dimension set is all database dimensions. So this would be all dimensions across the entire database. Or I could just select AdventureWorks DW cube dimensions, which is the only cube in this database. But basically, then we're only going to see the dimensions that are part of this cube. Okay, so you can see that by default, the role has access to all of the dimensions. So it's got read access to the measures, the products, geography, date, or reseller. And you can see that it has checkboxes here to say inherit basically the security from the database level. So let's see, if I go to all database dimensions and I say this does not have this has read or write access here to this dimension, then at this level, at the cube level, it's also going to have read or write access to that dimension there, geography. But I'm going to go back here. I'm going to change this back to read. Okay, and then we'll go back here. Alrighty. And I think I'm just going to leave this the way it is here. So we want to go over here to the dimension data tab so we can configure basically what members of this dimension that we want to allow the users in this role to have access to. So let's just pretend that this is a role we're setting up for people that are on the bike sales team. So in the example of AdventureWorks, we've got 4 product categories. We've got bikes, we've got accessories, we've got clothing, and I forget what the other one is, but it doesn't matter. So if this was a role for members of the bike sales team, we only want to allow members of this role to see the data associated with the bikes product category, because we really don't want them seeing access to we really don't want them seeing the numbers for the sales numbers for the accessories or the clothing team, because they get really violent, and we've really had it up to here with their fist fights at the water cooler. So we want to make sure that we only allow them to see sales numbers associated with the bikes. So excuse me. To set this up, I can go here to the product at the database level. So this is at the database level. AW is the database. And then I've got the AdventureWorks DW cube in here, so I could set it up if I want it at the database level or at the cube level. I could do that here. So we're going to do this at the database level because we don't want them to be able to get to any other information outside of their product team. So I'll select product here, and we can see all the different members of the product attribute. Components. Components was the fourth one. So I can deselect all the members here, and I'm going to say that I only want them to have access to the bikes member. So I do not want members of this role to have access to accessories or clothing or components numbers. I just want them to be able to see bikes. So I'm going to save this. Okay. Let's just change the name of this real quick. Let's change this to bikes. Make sure you leave the dot role there, but I'm going to name this called the bikes, so that way it's a little more indicative of what this role is being used for. So members of this role can only see the numbers associated with bikes. If I go to the advanced tab here, you can see that it added the MDX here to create the allowed member set. So the allowed member set here is the bikes category, so that's what the 1 means. That's the key value for the bikes category. We talked about briefly talked about this, the allowed member set. So these are the members that are allowed to be seen. Any members here would be members that are not allowed to be seen, and we can set up a default member here. Okay, so we've created this bike security role, and it only has access to bikes. So let's save this, and I'm going to deploy. And this is a really small cube, so this should take just a split second. Okay, great. And now I'm going to go over here to the cube, and we're going to browse. Let me reconnect first. Let me see. Okay. That was when I was playing a second ago. Left that up. Okay, so I'm connected here to the cube. We've created our bikes role. So if I want to impersonate this role for the purpose of testing, if I come up here and I click on this icon here, this will allow us to impersonate this role. So I can click that, and I can come here and click the roles button here, and I can select this is the role that I want to pretend to be for purposes of testing at this point. So I'll select that and hit OK. Alright, and you can see the little message it gives us is you are browsing the cube using the credentials of the following roles bikes. So we're browsing the cube as if we were members of the role bikes. Alright, so let's dig into our product dimension here. Let's go to our categories, and the only thing we're going to see here is bikes. This is a name set that I had created when I was teaching the MDX class, and I forgot to rip it back out, but the reason we're seeing this name set here is because bikes is a member of this name set, but if we were to drag this in, you'd see that we can't see it because the other members of this name set we do not have permission to see. So the only member, you can see that the only member that we're going to be able to see is the bikes member here of the product category attribute. So if I drag in category, I'm going to see bikes. Alright, let's just bring in some of our numbers. Alright, so let's take a look at this real quick. Alright, so you can see that we only see the bikes, which is good. Just ignore this for now. We only see bikes. Let me see that we've got 79 million reseller cost, and then we've got 78 million reseller sales amount. But you see that the number here, the grand total, does not match what our total here at the bikes level is showing. The reason for that is because at this point, just because we have only allowed this role to see the bikes member, the total is still reflecting the total amount for all of the other categories, such as the accessories and components and the clothing. So fix that, we need to go back to our role. And remember when I was talking about enable visual totals and how it's just easier to demonstrate? Oops. If I click this, what that's going to do is that's going to allow us to show the correct total based on the security. So if I'm only allowed to see bikes product category, the members of this role should not be able to see the total amount, including the sales amounts for the other categories. because then they could maybe reverse engineer the numbers and figure out what the other categories were doing sales wise. So if I click enable visual totals here, this will correctly total up the grand total for us. All right, let me save that. Okay, I'm gonna do one other thing. Let me go back here to and rip out that name set, so that way we don't have that problem again. Okay, I'm gonna save this, and now I'm gonna deploy. Okay, that's done. Let's go back to our browser. I'm gonna reconnect. All right, let's bring back out this. Let's go back to category, drag in the category here, and I'm not sure why that's still in there. Other products, because I missed it. Let me delete that very quickly. Let's redeploy. Okay. Reconnect. Okay, good. It's gone now. And now you can see that the grand total is correct. It doesn't include numbers from the other product categories. We're only seeing the bikes numbers. And so that way, members of this role do not have access to those other product categories. Okay, so now that we've talked about how to set up the dimension security, and we've defined how to set up access to a certain member of a role, now let's create a new role, and we're going to talk about setting up cell security. So I'm going to right click on roles, and I'm going to select new role, and we want to rename this. Let's rename this, and we'll just call this middle managers. Okay. And make sure we click yes. And we're going to go to the cell data tab here. And oops, first thing is we want to make sure that we give them read access. I forgot. It's kind of important. Okay. And then on the cell data tab, we need to select the cube that we want to set up our cell security for. And I want to make sure that I give them enable read permissions. So we're going to make sure that basically when we set up this, we're going to check this box, and it's going to give them read permissions on everything. So we're going to give them access to everything, and basically when we set up cell security, we set it up as defining what they cannot see. So by checking this checkbox, they can see everything in the cube. They can see all the measures, and basically now we need to tell it which measures they cannot see. All right. So to do that, we can click this little ellipsis button here to help us write the MDX. So basically we need to tell it that we do not want the current member of the measures dimension to be, let's see, reseller sales, and let's do reseller cost. So basically we're writing an expression that says, current member. We do not want the current member to be the measure reseller cost. So we're giving them access to all of the measures in the cube except for this one. So the measure cannot be this. All right. So I'm going to click OK. And so we've given them access to all the measures in the cube except for the reseller cost measure here. So I'm going to save this, and let's deploy. All right, great. Now let's go back to our cube, and we're going to browse again, so we need to reconnect. And let's go up here to our change user, and we're going to change from bikes, we're going to go to middle managers. Okay, let's come back here. We're going to go to our reseller sales measure group. There's reseller cost. So if our logic was correct, we should be able to see the reseller sales amount, but we should not be able to see reseller cost. All right, great. So even though I still see it here in the metadata viewer, I still can't. I can't actually see the number for reseller cost. That's perfect. That's exactly what we want. But what will happen if a member or a user is a member of both roles? So imagine we've got a middle manager who is a middle manager of the bikes product team. So he's going to fall under both roles. So he's going to be a member of the bikes role, and he's also going to be a member of the middle manager's role. What will happen? Well, let's go back up here, and we're going to go to our roles, and we're going to select both. So we're going to impersonate the credentials of a user who is a member of both roles. So if I click OK, we're reconnected. So I'm going to bring in reseller cost, and I can see reseller cost. And let's also bring in reseller sales amount, so I can still see the reseller sales amount. And if I go to product and I drag in the category, I can see all the categories. And basically, what's happening is if someone is part of multiple roles, the security is additive. So because the middle manager's role has access to all of the categories, and the bikes role has access to all of the measures, the security is basically canceling each other out. So it's going to be additive. So if we only want certain role, if we only want the bikes role to have access to the bikes, if somebody is a member of the bikes and the middle managers, and we only want them to have access to the bikes, we need to make sure that we remove the security here for the product categories, so that way they do not have access to any of the categories, and we'll let the security for categories be handled with the other role. So let's go to middle managers here. We're going to go to our dimension data tab. Okay, let's find product. Okay, and we're going to deselect all. So we do not want, if you're only a middle manager, you shouldn't see any of the product categories. And the purpose of this is so that we can manage the viewing of the categories with the other roles. So I'm going to select that. Okay. And on the bikes role here, we don't want members of the bikes role to see certain measures. So if we don't want them to see, if we don't want this role to handle defining which measures can be seen, we need to make sure here that we eliminate all of the measures from this role here. So measures current number is reseller sales amount or reseller cost. Okay, so let's click OK, and I'm going to save it, and let's deploy. Okay, it's done. All right, now I'm going to reconnect. Okay, great. So this is exactly the kind of behavior that we're wanting. So if somebody is a member of the bikes role, they should only see the bikes category, so this is correct. And if somebody is a member of the middle manager's role, they should not see the reseller cost, so this is correct. And if somebody is a member of the bikes and the middle manager's role, then they should not be able to see the reseller cost, and they should only see the bikes, so this is correct. So what we really should do to set this up correctly, if this was our security model we were implementing with this AS solution, we probably should come in here, and for the bikes role, we probably should hide all of the measures here. So if I want to if I want to restrict multiple measures from being viewed by members of this role, I need to basically list them all out here, which is kind of a little tedious. So I'll say measures current member is Okay, so we don't want them to see that one, or the reseller sales amount, or any of our sales quota amount. You see how this could get tedious, especially if you have a lot of measures. This is a small cube, so there's only a handful of measures here. But if you had a lot of measures, you could see how that this would get very time consuming. And I put the parentheses there, so I'm saying not measures current member is reseller cost or order quantity or sales amount or sales amount quota, gross profit margin, year to date, reseller sales, blah blah blah. So you can see how this could kind of be problematic, especially if somebody goes in and they add a new measure to the cube and they don't update the role, and then suddenly that role has access to a couple of new measures, and that's one reason why I don't think I've ever seen this type of security implemented for real for a client, just because this is kind of a pain in the butt to maintain. So usually the kind of security we implement is dynamic security, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But if you were going to implement this type of security model where you were using one role to, several roles to control access to, different attributes or different members of attributes, and then you're using another role to control access to cells in the cube, this is how you would do it. So I would come here and I'd set up no access to any of the measures in the bikes role, and then in the middle manager's role, I would disallow access to all of the product categories, and then give access to all of the cells in the cube, and let that be handled here. Okay, so if the middle managers weren't allowed to see resellers cost, but they could see all of the other measures, then this would work, because this will prevent them from seeing any of the reseller cost numbers. And then the bikes role isn't allowed to see any of the measures at all, so that way users who are members of both roles will be okay and see the correct permissions here. So let's save this and let's deploy again. While that's deploying, kind of I already mentioned the enable read contingent permissions. Basically what this does is this says that if the user does not have access to the base measures for a calculated measure, then they will not be able to see the calculated measure. So if we had a measure that was the reseller cost plus the reseller sales amount, or the reseller sales amount minus the reseller's cost to come out with the profit, and they did not have access to both of those base measures, then they would not have access to the calculated measure itself. And then if I wanted to set up enable read and write permissions for certain cells in the cube, if we wanted to give members of this role the ability to write back to the cube for certain cells, this is where I could set that up too. All right. Let's go back. I think this is still correct. Okay, so just to test out and make sure our security is working, this looks good. If somebody is only a member of bikes, then they should only be able to see the bikes member, or the bikes attribute, or the bikes member of the category attribute, so that looks good. All right, and if they're a member of middle managers, they should have access to all of the categories, I believe. Nope, none of the categories. That's correct, none of the categories, because bikes is handling the access to the categories. But I think this one should have access, but because of the visual totals here, we're not going to be able to see that. All right, let's go to bikes. All right, I think this is looking good. Okay. So we've talked about setting up dimension security. We walked through that with the example with bikes here. And then we talked about cell security, which we added here with middle managers and the bikes role. This leaves us to talk about the dynamic security, which is typically what we do because um, it seems to work pretty well, and it's easier to not easier to implement, but it's certainly easier to maintain. Um, so there's going to be several steps that we're going to have to go through to correctly set up dynamic security, and so um, we're going to walk through doing that, and we're going to create a new role for that. So if you're playing along, make sure that you've got Visual Studios open and Manager Studio open, because we're going to need to create a couple tables and then add those to the cube. Okay, so let's create a new role here, and we're going to call this one Dynamic. Oops, sorry, dynamic.role. All right, so yes. Okay, so before we get in here into developing this role and setting this all up, we've got to set up a couple tables. So I've created these two tables. They're actually in this database here called AW. I've created a users table and a bridge category user table. So basically we're going to data drive the security in our cube. So in this example, our security is going to be based off the category again. So we want certain users who are members of the bikes product category team to only have access to the numbers related to bikes, and then the members of the components category team, product category team, to only have access to the components numbers, and same thing for clothing accessories. So the two tables we'll need are the first table is a users table, and in the users table we're going to have a list of all of the users who will have access to the cube. So in this case it's just little old me. So there's me, but if we had hundreds of people who were part of our product teams, then we would have hundreds of people in our users table. And typically this is maintained through an SSAS package that pulls the members from the AD groups and loads them into here, and so that's easy to maintain because we can just do that with an SSIS package. So this is the first table we'll need. We'll need a users table, and typically it's very narrow, like this table is. We have a number for the user ID key, and then we have a string field, which is actually the username that includes the domain and then the username. And then the second table we'll need, this is actually the bridge table, where we basically define which users has access to which category. So you can see here that there's only two columns in this table. We've got the user ID column here, and then the category column here, and so we can see that the user with the user ID key of 1 has access to the categories with the ID of 1 and 2. So if we look at our dim product category dimension here, we can see that bikes is product category key 1 and components is product category key 2. So based on what we see here, we can see that user number 1 has access to bikes and components. Bikes and components. And so if we had other users in this table, we could set them up to have access to clothing and accessories. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and insert into that table real quick, just so we have a little bit better example. We also want to let's add the user first. I guess we should do that first. That make up a new user. Just for the sake of example. Okay. Database. Okay. Cool. And then I think that was Okay, so we want user 3 to have access to product category 3 and product category number 4. Okay, good. All right, so let's run this. Okay, cool. So user number 1 has access to categories 1 and 2, and user number 3 has access to categories 3 and 4. So this looks good. Okay, so we set up 2 tables. We set up the users table, which has a list of all of the users who are going to have access to our cube in one way or another. And then we have the bridge table, which is going to be the bridge table that is related between users and the categories dimension, which is where we specify which users have access to which categories. So I'm not going to diagram here because when we add these tables to the DSV and the cube, you'll be able to see it a little bit better, and hopefully you'll be able to understand it there. So let's go to our bids, and we're going to go into the DSV. Okay, so our security for our dynamic security is going to be based off product category. All right, so we need to add our new tables to our DSV. So to add the new table, you can just right click anywhere in the blank area of the DSV and click add remove tables. All right, and make sure you select the correct data source. So if you typically the tables will exist in the same database as your main data source. Just in this example, I created it in my little AW database, so that way I can blow it away without having to blow away the Adventure Works database. Okay, so I want to add users here, and I want to add the bridge category user table. And I'll click OK. All right, there's my new tables. All right, so this is our bridge table where we've set up, where we define which users have access to which categories. So we're going to create a foreign key relationship to the user ID here from the bridge table. And it's going to say the destination of the table of the newly created relationship has no primary key defined. Do you want to create a logical primary key? We'll say yes. And then here from the category, we're going to create a foreign key relationship to the product category key here. So you can see that. Let me drag this over here so it's a little bit easier to look at. Okay, so this is our bridge table, and this basically defines which users have access to which categories, and you see that it's related to the product category dimension, and it's also related to the users dimension. So this is basically going to be a dimension. And so now that we've set up the DSV, this looks good. Let's save this. I'm going to close these other roles real quick since we don't need those anymore at this moment. Okay, we'll leave that there. All right. Now that we've created our users dimension, or we've brought the users table into our DSV, we actually need to create a dimension from this table here. So I'm just going to right click on the dimensions folder in the Solution Explorer and click New Dimension. And this is going to be based off an existing table. And the main table is users. There it is. There's the key column. Looks good. All right, next. And that looks good there. Okay, so wait, we want to make sure that username is part of this. All right, looks good there. And we'll just call this our user dimension. And we'll click finish. All right, great. So we've got our new users dimension. So I'm just going to close this for now. And then in our cube, just because we've created the user dimension does not mean that this dimension is actually being used in this cube yet. But before we can bring in the users dimension to the cube, we need to create our new measure group based off that bridge table. So let's click that icon there. So in case you missed that, we're going to click this little button here, which is the create new measure group icon. And our measure group is based off the bridge category user table. So I'm going to click OK there. All right. And we can see that it has detected that relationship between product and the bridge category user table. using the product category, so that's correct. Now that we have the relationship, now that we have added this as a measure group to our cube, we need to add the user's dimension to the cube now. So I can just right click here on the dimensions and click add cube dimension, or I can click this icon here, which says add cube dimension, and then I select the dimension I want to add. Okay. And you can see that it's automatically detected that there's a relationship there. So it's created that regular relationship between user ID, users, and the bridge category user table using the user ID, and it's also created the relationship between product and bridge category user using the category. Okay, so this looks good. One other thing that I want to do, usually you probably would hide this measure, depending on if they think it's useful, if the client thinks it's useful, or if that's something they want to see, if they want to see a count of the users that have access to that category or whatever. But we'll leave this visible for our purposes, just so that we can see. Okay, so save this. All right, let's deploy this. All right, looks good. All right, so now let's go browse our cube. Let's reconnect. All right, and let's just browse this as the current user without the security roles in place. All right, so here's our new measure group, bridge category user. We've got our users count here. Okay, so we've got four rows in that table, so that looks right. If I bring in username, okay, that looks good. There are 2 users in there, and they each had 2 rows to them. And then if I bring in category, all right, I think that looks right. Let's move this around a little bit so we can. All right, great. So I had access to bikes and components, and the new user had access to accessories and clothing. So you can see that our security is well on its way to working. So I'm only getting a count for the categories that I should have access to, and then the other user is getting a count for the categories that that user should have access to. So I think this looks good. So now the fun part is we basically need to modify our role to only, depending on the user, we need to modify the role to only allow access to the categories that that user has access to. And to do that, we're going to have to write a little bit of nifty MDX. So this looks good. Let's go to our dynamic. Let's go back to our dynamic role. So usually whenever I'm trying to write some MDX that's going to be used in the cube, I'll usually write it in Management Studio because it's a little bit easier to troubleshoot there. Whereas if you're trying to troubleshoot MDX in bids, you're going to have to make your changes in bids and then deploy the changes out and then test your cube and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, you don't really know why. Then you got to come back to the cube and make your changes again. So that's why I do it in Management Studio, because it's a little bit easier to troubleshoot MDX there anyway. So I'm going to connect to my instance of Analysis Services. And the cube that I'm working with here is this guy. So I'm going to click New Query MDX. All right, so there's our dimension. Looks good. All right. So let's write a little bit of MDX. User account. Okay. All right, so that's right. So the purpose of writing this expression is we want to figure out a way to limit which categories the current user logged in can see. So we have our dimension here that has the users who have access to the cube in here. And so we're going to write an expression that's going to leverage the credentials of the currently logged in user and relate that to the dimension here, so that way we can make use of that, our nifty little dynamic security model we set up in our DSV. Okay, so we can bring in our, let's get our category first. All right, okay, great. All right, there's our categories. And so we want to only see the categories that since I'm the currently logged in user at this point, we only want to see the categories that I can see, which are the bikes and components, I believe. So to do that, we're going to use the non-empty function. All right. Okay. And so we only want to return the product categories where the where this measure is not empty. So that's what the non-empty function does. Is it's going to return a set where members in the next set are not empty. So we're only going to see categories where bridge category user count is not empty. So you can see here it's not quite working how we want it to. That's because all of these categories have a count. So we need to limit this category, the bridge category user count, to only count the ones that are tied to my username. So we're going to create a table here, and we're going to bring in my username. All right, looks good. All right, so if this works like I'm hoping it will, we should only see the categories that I have access to, and this looks like it's working. So I've used the non-empty function to only return the categories where the bridge category user count for this user, which is me, is not empty. So that's going to include bikes and components. So that's great, this works, but this is not exactly dynamic because my name is hard-coded in here. So to make this dynamic, we're going to use a couple different functions to do that. The first one is the string to member function. And what that function does is it takes a string value and converts it to a member. All right. Okay. There's a string to member function, so this should still work. Okay. But this is still hard coded, so this is a string value here now. This is being interpreted as a string, and then the string to member function is converting that into a member. So still working the exact same way as before, but it's not dynamic yet. So to make this dynamic, we need to replace this with a function called username. And so what this function here is going to do is return the username of the currently logged in user, which in this case is me. So if I run this now, I'm still seeing bikes and components, and my username is not hard-coded in here before. So this should still work for other users who are also in the users dimension. So as long as they're in the users dimension, and this should still work. So this is the function here, or this is the MDX here that we're going to build into our role. So that way, when somebody logs in, members of that role log in, then they will only see categories that they are allowed to see based on the dimension security we set up. So let's copy this. All right, let's go to dimension data, back to the dimension data tab. And we're going to go to products. All right, and we want to go to advanced, and we want to set the allowed set So which categories am I allowed to see? It's going to be these categories where the category user count um, for this user is not empty. So that's what we're setting up here. So that MDX that we tested in Management Studio and got working there, where we were just copying and pasting it over here. So I think this should work. This looks good. Make sure we click Enable Visual Totals so the totals look correct. And I'm going to save this. All right, now let's deploy. All right, great. Looks good. All right, let's reconnect. All right, so let's impersonate our dynamic role that we created. All right, let's go to dynamic. Let's see. Uh-oh, Q cannot. Oh, I don't think I gave myself read access. Oops, I guess that would be important, huh? We need to make sure that this user has access to read Q. Minor detail left out there. Sorry guys, let's deploy again. Oops. You have to forgive me, it's very late here. I'm very tired. All right, let's reconnect. All right, looks good now. We're browsing as the dynamic role, so that's good. All right. So if this is working correct, I should only have access to bikes and components. So let's check out categories and bikes and components. Yay, looks like it's working. So now you can see that I haven't had to do anything special to get this to work. We've just set this up at the table. We can data drive this at the table level, and members of the dynamic security role then can only see the product categories that they should see. So you can see it looks like it's working correctly here. So that's pretty cool. So I hope those examples were pretty straightforward and that hopefully you understand a little bit better about the different ways we can set up security within analysis services. We talked about, just to recap, we talked about setting up security at the dimension level by allowing users to have access to only certain members of an attribute in a dimension. So in this example, we only set up, I think we did at the database level, we only set up access to the bikes category in the bikes role. Then in the middle manager's role, we set up access to this role to have access, members of this role to have access to all of the measures except for the reseller cost measure. And then in the dynamic security role, we created our dynamic security model using a couple tables, using the bridge table and the users table. And we wrote a little bit of clever MDX to only allow members of that role to see the categories that they were tied to in the table. If you want to see another great example of dynamic security, Devin Knight has written a really good article that's out on bidn.com about doing that. So if you just go into Google and type in bidn.com:dynamic security, the very first one that comes up. And he walks through an example that's very similar to mine, except he does his with state. So users that are salespeople for a certain state can see only the sales data associated with their states. So this is definitely a good article to check out if you want to learn more about setting up dynamic security. Definitely a good article to read. I would do that. But thanks for watching this video. Let me put up my contact info. So if you have a question about something, you can email me, dryan@pragmaticworks.com, or I guess if you feel so inclined, you can send me a message on Twitter. But probably the best way if you have a question about something like that is to email me directly. So that way I'll respond directly to you. Thanks, guys.